as they say, and now for something completely different. I'm eager to share some material that I've been working on quite recently that I actually haven't had the chance to present before. But in talking with Doug about the good work that you do, we talked a little bit about how in an event like this, there's encouragement for resting together, spending time together and building relationships, for thinking about the mission and purpose that we have in the field of church music, but then also thinking about some things like staff relationships and interpersonal dynamics. And so it's really that led me to select this material to share with you for the next little bit. And it's about an emerging field, really, called the field of cultural intelligence. A couple years ago, I had a chance to be at a training seminar at a big hotel downtown Chicago with all kinds of folks, and I don't think anybody in the room was a musician. It was very unusual, actually, to be in a corporate training setting. But what I remember very vividly is that the person sitting next to me was the head of human resource training for Qatar Airlines. Now think about it. They have to hire hundreds of people who get to work 16-hour flights with 300 people on a huge jet, and those people are from every culture in the world. Those people not only speak different languages, they are culturally wired to see the world in very different ways. And I remember thinking, I don't think I've ever learned as much in one training session as that. And it's that actually gave rise to what I'll share today. I don't know, do you remember when the Myers-Briggs came on the scene? I was very young, but I have very vivid memories of a couple dear friends of mine, a little bit older, who are just beginning to learn from this, saying, I am so glad because as an introvert, I feel seen. And especially, I think, in the field of choral music, we tend, I think, to be an extrovert-friendly place. Introverts have their place too, but there's something about the whole esprit de corps of engaging that does tend to make, especially music. I always think if you want a real extrovert fest, ACDA, actually, it often feels that way. Here's what I love about the Myers-Briggs. The Myers-Briggs, at least in my experience, taught us to love introverts and extroverts. It taught us to value difference and not to make one disposition feel like the norm against which others would be judged. It doesn't always work that way, but culturally, I actually think there's been a bit of a shift. It's done some cultural teaching. And this very interesting book called Introverts in the Church, Finding Our Place in an Extroverted Culture, it actually kind of bears witness to that and what it was like on a church staff for people to create space so that people with very different dispositions and personalities could flourish. Maybe for you it's the Myers-Briggs, it might be the Enneagram, it might be the Berkman, it might be the other, all kinds of these personality disposition tests that really have at their background the desire to help us know what makes ourselves tick and to learn to recognize what makes other people tick, and ideally so that we can work in ways in which everybody sits in their own personality or dispositional sweet spot. Yet I found that there is a limit to the insights that come from that material. It's actually very good insofar as it goes, but here's a gap that I've encountered in pretty significant ways. In the seminary teaching I've done for the last, until this summer, 28 years in a row at Calvin Theological Seminary up in Grand Rapids, we would have a very sizable percentage of the student body, about 25%, who would be of Korean descent. Mostly, about half of them from Korea, about half of them Korean Americans. And so we had two, typically, larger cultural groups within the seminary that actually saw the world in very different ways. And I experienced it profoundly on the very first day of class. It turns out for 20 plus years, was like a living lab experiment about something called power distance. So my Korean students would walk in on the very first day of class, and they would walk in and bow and say, Dr. Witvliet. And my students from America would often walk in, put their arm around me, and say, can't wait to learn together, John. I mean, maybe that's a little hyperbole, okay, but the difference was palpable. And here's what I began to notice. When my American students came in and treated me very casually, my Korean students became extremely anxious, like it almost blew their circuits, in order to experience that cultural difference happen. Those Korean students expected that I would lecture for 45 minutes of solid material. They flew halfway around the world to listen to lectures. They wanted a high power distance experience of teaching and learning. In general, my American students did not want me to lecture for 45 minutes, and they were supported by a wealth of new pedagogical materials that teach me to make class interactive. And you want to know what creates anxiety in those Korean students. It's being put in a small group to talk together. We did not come here, one of them eventually told me, to hear the ignorance of my fellow classmates. Yeah. Here's the thing. What this gets at is a huge cultural hardwiring. Geert Hofstede, a theorist from the Netherlands, did some work on this, and he said, think of it like software of the mind. The culture in which we're born actually forms us with all kinds of ways of perceiving the world that if we don't understand it, we can even understand dispositional differences, but we'll miss it in significant ways. Power distance, by the way, also works in church. I've been in some churches in Nashville where I drive into the parking lot of the church and I see a sign right by the door, parking, reserved, senior pastor. Right next to it, parking, reserved, first lady. Now I'm just going to reflect on the church that I have been a part of in Grand Rapids for the last 28 years. And once I served on a pastoral search committee. Here's one thing I guarantee. If a candidate came to the church I was a part of and said, oh, I'd love to come to this church, provided I have a reserved parking place at the door, that candidate would not have made it into the second round. Church I was a part of in Grand Rapids was a low power distance church. Right? The church with the parking signs would be a high power distance church. Here's what the training session sitting next to the expert from Qatar Airlines taught me. I need to understand that both can be virtuous and both can have vice. There's a difference, but I had to unlearn the judgment that I would attach to these. The judgment that actually both my American and Korean students had of each other's cultural wiring. And I remember the first day, about 6 years ago, when I walked in the first day of class and said, before we actually talk about liturgical theology, I would like to introduce you to a very interesting concept. It's called power distance. And I would do about 2 minutes on this topic. And I cannot tell you, like, the gratitude that kicked in. Because each kind of group, I think, felt seen and known and named. And it created a little space where even if, there was points of uncomfortability, people had a concept to sort of metabolize that. It ended up being a great help. And by the way, there are places in any given culture where one is actually a little better than the other. I tend to notice that cross-country teams, I just finished a 12-year stint as a cross-country parent. I tend to notice that that's a low-power distance culture. Coach runs with the kids, a little quiet word. Football, not so much. No, high-power distance. Let's see. if church staff, in my experience, I appreciate that low power distance. When I get on an airplane, I'm rather grateful for high power distance. The pilot is so distant from me, I can't even get into the cockpit. A heart surgeon, probably the same thing. See? So requiring us to understand that one is not virtuous, one is not vice, they're different.
And choir directors or?
Well, hang on here. Hang on. That's where I'm going, right there. David Livermore's book, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, is one place to start in this world of insight and learning. And a second really good book, actually all three of these, Aaron Meyer's Culture Maps, probably the quickest way to kind of get into this literature. The more theoretical approach is Garrett Hofstede's Cultures and Organizations, Software of the Mind. Briefly, Aaron Meyer says that we can think about cultures not in terms of just one dimension, power distance, but 8 or so very different dimensions. So in 45 minutes, all I can do is sort of point at the 8. Here's one, time perception. My dear friend and collaborator, some of you have heard him speak at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. We had him come almost every year to talk about this. We'd talk about time perception. He said when he grew up in a Navajo culture, they grew up in a culture that honored people by attending to a relationship. And if you were in a conversation with a person, you honored that relationship by never leaving until the conversation was done. He said when he went to UCLA as an undergraduate student, what he had to learn is that UCLA ran the opposite way around. You honored a meeting by showing up on time, which he said frequently made him violate his own cultural wiring because he had to end a conversation in order to get to one. Some theorists refer to this as the difference between polychronic and monochromatic sense of time, or task versus relationship. But there are just huge cultural dynamics, especially around time perception, especially across cultures in a North American context. And that one has taken me a while to learn that one way of being in time is not more virtuous necessarily than the other. There are virtuous and more vice-like ways of inhabiting each of those time worlds, but we often run a little stuck when both of them are trying to coexist. I'll refer to a couple of these other dimensions as we go. So now all those choirs. So here's my 45-second Aaron Meyer's culture map viewed through the lens of choral music. Some choirs seem to me to be very individualistic. 20 individuals singing in their own individual way. Other choirs, communal identity to the core. Individual identities absorbed in the whole, and blend and unity of focus is a cultural value. Some choirs operate in rehearsal in a low-context communication situation. Every act of communication is explicit, where others are very high context, a little gesture, a little unspoken dimension. It's mostly, a lot of choral conductors thrive in a high context mode of communicating. Right? Two very different approaches. Some choirs feature direct communication. You know, I showed up at an all-state choir in high school, and I remember a choir director just looking at us and saying, "Basses, you are utterly flat." And I had never heard that in my life, because I grew up in a high school choir with a master of indirect communication. You know, we would be singing terribly, and he would just look at us and go a little like, "Better." And we knew that we were singing terribly. That communication style is not just a disposition thing, though. There are huge cultural differences. I don't have time today to tell you that some of the funniest videos online are the difference between Dutch and British culture on this score, and how communication works, how directly it works. Some musical ensemble, fiercely egalitarian, some very hierarchical. Certain choirs do come to mind, actually, in that area. And often, that's what you need. It strikes me, symphony choirs often work in a very hierarchical way. The larger you get, the less egalitarian it works. Of course, the use of time. The whole experience of literacy and orality is very interesting. There's a huge cultural literature about that difference. There are some choir concerts or worship services I will go to, and I think, and I appreciate this, but where it is a high literacy experience. All the texts, all the program notes, a ton of the meaning comes through stuff that's written. And there are other cultural contexts where if you were attending to those many words, you would be kind of not experiencing the culture because it is orality that's central. The range of emotional expression takes up a whole chapter in every one of these books. In certain cultural contexts, the range of emotion is vast, and if you've ever seen the movie Babette's Feast, about that amazing French cuisine that was cooked on that frigid village in Denmark, I mean, the widest range of emotional expression might have consisted of someone breaking out in a huge smile about like that. There's a huge range of emotional difference, right? When some of my dear friends who are from Italy meet my family, who is from the Netherlands originally, and vice versa, we, how shall we say, experience a little difference with respect to emotional range, yeah? And there's a cultural hardwiredness about it. So I had a chance to work on an essay that is going to be coming out in Oxford Handbook of Music and Theology on this topic. And for this essay, I took Aaron Meyer's Culture Map and the Hofstede and just started reading. These are some books that you might recognize. Just as widely as possible, choral music in different cultural contexts. And then finding amazing, very academic articles about choral music, thanks to the wonders of the internet. And so, you know, cultural studies about how Christmas music is sung in Helsinki, Finland, turned out to be a really interesting article. Or Choirs in Two Countries, a study of community music therapy for older adults in Norway and Japan. There is a whole literature, especially in the field of music education, around cultural difference writ large that is up against some of these cultural values. And then I want to express gratitude to 4 dear friends and teammates at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. Kaitan Chow, Saturina Reed, Maria Corneau, and Chandu Jang worked with me over the last few years, and Professor Kaitan Chow himself, a trained choral director, is actually teaching a course, a micro-credentialed course through Calvin that you can take on this material. And he takes every one of these cultural values, but then every example that he uses is an example from a ministry context. And so he's actually, I'm chasing his knowledge and awareness of this now as he's learning to teach about this in significant ways. So for example, a slide that he actually developed that we used in co-teaching, this difference between monochromatic and polychromatic sense of time. And yes, in one cultural context, it's orderliness. Time's up when you're done. Time is valuable. And by the way, I will end at noon. Just saying. Yeah, just saying. Interruptions are disruptive. In contrast to a more polychromatic sense of time, orderliness is optional. You're going to have a lot of things going on at the same time. Disruptions are welcome. And the way that these two very different ways of perception. And then there is emerging data, not just like people's impression of it, but actually data that is studying every one of these cultural concepts in different places around the world. And so the listing of certain countries across a spectrum on the bottom is a research-informed matter. And without going into great detail, I can say some of the most interesting examples are when you get in a single continent quite different approaches living side by side. And I don't think I've ever really been able to appreciate fully the difference between Japan and Korea, for example. Huge cultural difference. Yeah. And as I mentioned, the Netherlands and Great Britain. Yeah. Or Africa, that's a big continent, and yet we approach it often as one big sameness when it's simply not. Yeah, I'm so grateful for this area of study. And then the low context example. So a word about scale. Hofstede started this field researching global regions. How's Asia different from Europe? And then I've just mentioned some examples where you bring it down a level. Countries within Asia are different, countries within. But it also turns out to be true, 2 universities in the same country. I moved from Calvin to Belmont. Guess what? Cultural difference. Oh yeah, I'm not ready to quite put words on it yet. Yeah. I am going to tell you, I love it. Okay, I'm going to tell you that. It's really good. But wow, every once in a while I'm like, there's a little different cultural DNA going on here at Belmont. Yeah, yeah, just a little bit. 2 neighborhoods in the same city. 2 worship services in the same congregation. 2 congregations in the same denomination. I think, and that's really why I wanted to bring it here today, I think that there is so much to gain again by the personality dispositional tools. But I just think they miss a lot of these dimensions. And to me, once these categories are in place, I find myself, giving a little more benefit of the doubt and a little bit more, I hope, self-awareness. And so let me put some words around that, and then I'm eager to have a conversation with you. To me, this is an occasion, and this is where I take the article, for discipling I refer to it, this sounds fancy, but Oxford Handbook, you got to dress it up a little bit. So our Edic, emic, and hybrid vocations, okay? That's sociology language. It's in the field of cultural anthropology. Edic experience is when I go to a very different cultural context other than my own. I'm a guest, an observer, an outsider. I think that these 10 or so analytical spectra, okay, plural of spectrums, another way to say it, I guess, from cultural studies, when it really is motivated by agapic love, and it's disciplined by growing self-awareness and cultural humility, I think it helps us appreciate virtues across difference with greater nuance. I don't sit there at an ACA convention and think, wow, that choir's not very, unified. It's like everybody's an individual up there. Well, that actually might be how the culture is, how they're wired. Especially, of course, I'm referring to the international choirs that will come in, right? That very strong difference. So notice and appreciate virtues across difference with greater nuance. So ideally, the judgmentalism and the constraining stereotype goes down. Back at Calvin last night, I was delighted that our gospel choir and our concert choir were on stage together, probably the first time I can remember. Just wonderful colleagues working together. And so those colleagues had to figure out how to have a monochromatic sense of time and a polychromatic sense of time inhabit the very same stage. Now they are emotionally attuned directors, so a little teaching about the fact that there are 2 different ways of being musically, and each one can be beautiful, and where we can learn to appreciate that beauty equips those students powerfully. And I'm just saying, in a lot of congregations, a little bit of this between the traditional service and the contemporary service might help too. You know, you can have a little unity breakout in the middle of disunity is always a good thing, I think, whenever possible. And I think this tool can help us. Second, these same analytic spectra can free us from in our own self-understanding. One of my colleagues at Calvin for many years, Rebecca DeYoung, wrote an amazing book on virtues and vices. And in a reflection on the virtue of humility, she points out, drawing on Aristotle, that there are actually two opposites of true humility. One is arrogance, and one is pusillanimity, which you have to practice saying out loud a few times. Pusillanimity. Arrogance, of course, we recognize that, right? Pusillanimity is the, I'm not very good. In fact, I'm terrible. How many incoming voice students probably don't we need to actually help move beyond that with greater confidence? I find that as I've spent time with this literature, and again, in that table with the Qatar Airlines, I find myself thinking, I'm grateful to have language that helps me understand just what an indirect communicator I really am. I mean, I've had staff members tell me, will you just, say it? And now I can at least put a little twinkle in my eye and say, I'm a recovering indirect communicator, so help me out here. Yeah. You see, in a church staff, where sometimes we just cannot figure out what makes that person tick, a tool or two along like this can help us, I think. Yeah, that's it. And so then I'll go here. So this would be the charge and benediction out of this material. While all our viewing, cultural engagement, and understanding is provisional and perspective, we can, by God's grace, learn to resist arrogance and embrace companionship across difference. So my contention is that our callings are deeply enriched by paying attention not only as musicians to melody, harmony, rhythm, and form, but also to this profoundly powerful set of cultural values which form the software of our minds. Deeply internalizing the complementary values of contrasting culture also opens our minds, hearts, and imaginations to consider the pluriform ways that any number of Christian ideals, ideals like embodiment, entrainment, sincerity, beauty, sublimity, might be expressed. From a Christian theological perspective, choral music thrives across multiple cultural contexts and expressions of excellence. And this pluriformity is not a curse. It is a stunning gift. Every nation and culture bringing the glory of their culture into the coming kingdom. It is a stunning gift that invites us into ever more agapic, love-oriented, love-expressing practices of musicking, like making music together, connoisseurship. If any of us go to the symphony choir tonight, we're going to be connoisseurs. You know, a connoisseur is not just someone sitting in the audience. A connoisseur is a savorer, is savoring it because they have tools equipped to help them savor something across cultural difference. And discernment, too, helping us convey the aroma of Christ in communities where we taste like the fruit of the Spirit. So now that's my trial run with this material in public. So help me out here. I did want to leave time because I'm guessing there might be some examples, pushback. What about this? What do you think?
So my practical question is, well, I guess the question is an amalgamation of both, depending on circumstance, depending on context, the end goal. Like, what is the end game here? I'm sitting in a position where, like, I'm already processing how we're going to fund to have you come and present to our staff.
Right.
And actually, just trying to convince my staff that needs to happen.
Yeah.
Because this is, and yes, I'm sitting in personally as a choir director processing.
Yeah.
But my post embodies all of those: the congregation, the style, the staff, everything.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I do want to say, I sort of gave you like the whole master's degree worth of material in 30 minutes. Okay, a little bit intentionally though, to try it out. So I do want to say, I think that most staff groups can really benefit from some almost annual work on some tool. And in my experience, there needs to be some exercise so that you have a common language to understand why people get anxious at such different moments and in such different ways. And when you realize, so-and-so always gets anxious if we're not starting on time. And so-and-so always gets anxious if we don't actually complete the conversation. Just knowing that, I find helps. Right? Now listen, if you're dealing with people that are just unhealthy people, that no tool is going to help. But with people generally have good intentions, want it to go well, a little bit of understanding can help. I tend to find that about every year is important. And the other thing though is not like 6 weeks of this in a row. So it's just a little self-awareness. Okay? And then next year it's a little more self-awareness. And so it becomes kind of a way of life. But what I find is that if you just are thinking at the individual disposition level, it only goes so far. And especially in the multicultural wonder of a city like Nashville or a university. Then having the tools really does help. So they're training the Qatar airline staff to serve meals to people who, let's just say, communicate very differently back to them. And so they're helping those staff members learn how to recognize and receive a criticism or a compliment and maybe think twice about it. Like maybe a person is really ticked off, but they're not from a direct communication culture. And if you don't recognize that they're actually trying to give you a pretty strong word, you might miss it. And so when you can be trained to little point of awareness, right? It's an awareness raising mechanism. Yeah. So I will just say, especially based on my seminary teaching, it just felt like this opens up a world. Just like opens up a world. It also, by the way, I will say, I was so glad I had this when I went to that Coptic nativity service, which, by the way, some great choral experience of that chant in this town. But if you look at it through the lens of, I'm guessing many of the choirs that we would experience in worship, you almost don't have the categories to appreciate it. So you need some liturgical categories, some musical categories, but you need some cultural categories too. Yeah. Someone else. Go ahead.
The Enneagram is what's helped our staff.
Yeah. Great. Yep. Yeah. It's powerful.
So in other words, there's more than one way of being right.
Yeah, right. It's difference. Yes. And here's the thing. Every one of us is finite. So none of us can be both pure extrovert and pure introvert. Can't do it. The world needs both. And all kinds of people in the middle. And what I love about it is if you go on the internet, look and type in Aaron Meyer culture map, and then do a search for images. You have these 8 binaries or spectra, and then you will get these images of the crisscrossing of cultures. So it's not like all 8 of these binaries cluster in predictable ways. So some highly emotional cultures, like wide range of emotional expression, end up being, they're that way, and they're high power distance. And others are that way, and they're low power distance. And what you wind up with is almost an infinite number of combinations. And to me, that's the pluriform wonder of it. And then again, I come back and say, and guess what? I'm pretty much from exactly one of those myriad of possibilities. And so again, we avoid kind of making our own cultural wiring the norm. My guess is the world would be a happier place if we could get to that spot, I think. Go ahead.
We just recently went through a whole Strengths Finder process.
Yeah.
And we've actually started adapting what staff
Yeah.
based on that.
Great.
Because the previous model of, well, this is that person's job.
Yeah.
But then at the end of that, they're like, oh,
Yes.
they suck at execution.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
So we can't count on them to do
Yep.
that. But they're great in this area.
Yeah.
And so we've adapted. And
I love
actually,
that.
We're working much more efficiently
Yeah.
that way. But we're on the start.
I love it. And one little word on that. I find it really helpful to have the conversation which says we want to get as many people on the team as possible, up to about 75%. So there's no way everybody's going to be 100% of the time in their sweet spot. But what we want to get people out of is the 25% of the time, right? If you had everybody in the 100% range, no one would ever grade papers. No assignments would ever get graded. Because really, right? Probably, because that's not typically the thing we want to do. So anyway, that's just a little word about you want to get that ratio up. And then the other little thing is, to me, it's helpful. You really can't, in my experience, have a choir that both starts perfectly on time and finishes the task. You really can't do both because we're finite. But you can narrate the kind of choir you are. So, yeah, our choir is going to be punctual. We are going to start on time. But we're going to do it aware that this is one way of being in the world. And thanks to all of you polychromatic singers that are actually overcoming quite a bit to get here. Thank you. So an acknowledgement of that. And sometimes where, okay, monochromatic singer, you're used to being here on time, or you're going to go to a concert that's going to start it's going to be announced to start at 7 o'clock, and it'll start at 7:23, and it's just going to go for a while. Yeah, Coptics are 7 hours. Kind of a wonder. And by the way, after you're there a while, you kind of just don't even want to check your watch because it's so immersive, which is kind of the point. It's actually quite amazing. But the only reason I resisted checking my watch is because I had done a little work on this. And I actually knew I had something I had to overcome, which is my own perpetual habit to check my watch. As we get toward the end, I will tell you my favorite story of teaching some of this material with Mark Charles. So Mark came to my seminary class one day, and we started talking about time perception. And I knew that these students, and it was noon literally when we ended, I knew these students had no class after that. So Mark got going at about 11:52, and he just kept talking. So 12:05, 12:07, students were sliding to the edge of their chair, pulling up the briefcase, they were like this, ready to go. And Mark just kept talking. And we made it all the way to about 12 or 13. And finally I did interrupt Mark, and I just said, friends, we have just experienced the most profoundly instructive parable. Because we have experienced how much of that cultural software of the mind we live with. Mark didn't even notice. Never would have occurred to him. So, anyway, I look forward to more learning on this and hearing from you over time too. And hopefully we'll all wind up working together in healthy and good ways. So thank you all. Yeah.